Hey everybody, welcome to the first lecture of Module 2. In this module we're going to be focusing on the legislative process, the basic, normal legislative process, and I have to hold myself back from air quoting normal because in some ways the normal legislative process has been significantly disrupted in recent years. But I want to give an overview of the basic normal legislative process, and I'm going to note how things have transformed over the course of recent decades and recent years. For the rest of the module, we're going to look at the influences over how things move through this basic legislative process, the groups, individuals, and factors and forces that go to work on a bill as it moves through the legislative process. For this first lecture, I'm going to focus on the idea of a bill. We're going to kind of track a bill. Now, in a slightly more sophisticated way than the "I'm Only a Bill" song from Schoolhouse Rock. The video is linked as an optional video in this module, and I would suggest actually watching it, not just out of humor and curiosity, but it really does, in fact, give an accurate overview of the normal legislative process and the kinds of things that could happen that either facilitate a bill moving through that process or derail it. Schoolhouse Rock got it right, and it is a simplified version, but it doesn't change the nature of it by simplifying it. So I would recommend that. Today what I'm going to do is kind of also follow a bill, or actually follow the process of crafting a bill and transforming a bill from what happens at the beginning to what happens at the end of the legislative process. I'm not going to go through the very complex diagram that I'm going to pause here right now to put up on the screen. Here is the diagram of the full sort of legislative process in all its complexity. I'm going to have this linked to the Module 2 page, so you can download this when it goes away. So now we're back to me standing here in a classroom on PSU campus, and I'm going to use my chalk on this board today to sort of try to, without being too messy, try to track how it is that bills come about, get worked on and transformed, get voted on yes or no at various important stages, and ultimately get passed or rejected. Now, there are two main ways that a bill comes to be part of the legislative process. One is that it arrives as a bill. It arrives with legislative language. So we have here a bill in legislative language. In other words, it is policy that has been in fact operationalized in the way that a bill needs to be written so that it can be directly transformed into that policy. So legislative language is policy in technical terms. And bills are often extremely long. Major pieces of legislation can be 700, 800, 1,000 pages long. Budget bills are routinely 800, 1,000 pages long. Bills can be in the dozens of pages, in the hundreds of pages. They vary depending on how much policy there is to actually enact. But if you ever want to know what policy really looks like in technical language, go to either the House or the Senate website and download a bill that either has been passed or that is pending, and you can read through it. And good luck getting through it because it's a lot of very dry language and it is extremely dense and particular. One of the things that happened for the COVID relief bill, the American Rescue Plan, is that some senator, I forget who it was, Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, demanded that the entire bill be read out loud on the floor of the Senate. It took, I think, 12, maybe 14 hours with a rotation of Senate clerks reading it out loud, and it was hundreds and hundreds of pages long, which is not atypical. That was a weird bit of political theater. It didn't do any good. It didn't change anything. It just delayed the ultimate voting on amendments by about 12 hours, and it tired out these poor underpaid Senate clerks, and Ron Johnson's a jerk for making it happen. But it indicates how much the legislative language is technical and detailed and long. Go look at a bill and give yourself 5 minutes to just skim through it and realize how much it's going to make your eyeballs bleed. A bill can arrive this way because it's already been written by a legislator's legislative staff, or more likely it's been written by some outside interest group. So where does this bill come from? One of the places this can come from is from an outside group, outside interest group, or from a member of Congress themselves. And why would a member of Congress produce something that has detailed policy, detailed legislative language, policy and technical terms? Because they want to introduce this bill directly into the legislative process and have it then worked on, researched, hearings held, amendments debated and argued, expert witnesses brought in. This is the streamlined way to make sure something can get through, can enter the legislative process and kind of get right on the freeway really quickly. Like, this is the freeway entrance ramp. Interest groups write bills because they don't just have basic policy ideas, right? They have policy preferences, but they also will translate them into specific language. And an interest group has an even keener interest in having a fully written bill, because they're basically not just saying, "Dear Santa Claus, this is what I want for Christmas." They're saying, "Dear Santa Claus, here's the link to Amazon page to get this thing exactly that I want." And it's interesting because I bring this up because a bill is like, asking Santa Claus for something in certain kinds of ways, because it's a wish list, and it's not going to get translated right into a piece of legislation, not usually. But my kids actually went through the process where when they were little, they would just ask for what they wanted, and they would put in a little note, and we would fake mail it to Santa. Then, once they grew up and there was no Santa Claus, they would actually start including links. They didn't just say, "I want these Nike sneakers." They'd be like, "I want these Nike sneakers, and here they are. I want this board game, and here's the link on Amazon. I want this thing, and here's where you can get it." Interest groups, they would love as much of their exact technical language included in the final bill as possible. And so instead of just saying to their legislators or having their lobbyists say to the relevant members of the legislature, "Here's what we'd like to see," they're like, "This is what we want," right? And as a parent of a person who's received Amazon links for my kids for Christmas, I sometimes click through and just buy the damn thing. And sometimes I click through and look at it and go, "Okay, I'm not going to get you that thing," or I'm going to look around, maybe I'll get it somewhere less expensive, or maybe I'll get you a less expensive version of this thing that you want, so I'll go looking around. All of those are examples of what does happen once the bill begins to move through the rest of the process. At the state legislative level, this is a class about the United States Congress, but the same legislative process is used in state legislatures. But in the state legislative process, interest groups hand fully formed bills to the state legislatures, and in many cases, in literally thousands of cases, the final bill is almost identical to the bill that has been written by an interest group to give itself, all of the things it wants, every detail it wants, is given to a sympathetic member of the state legislature who introduces it. And often, because state legislators don't have the expertise to really even sometimes understand the complexities of a bill, they often leave it relatively untouched, and they're grateful, and they get a summary. There's an executive summary. There's a policy overview that tells them what this bill does, but they don't have the expertise to actually take it apart and put it back together again in a different form. They're like parents who are just like, "Okay, my kids gave me a bunch of Amazon links, and I'm just going to click through and buy all the stuff, and that's Christmas." The state legislatures are much more like that, largely because they're dealing with as complex of policy issues as the national legislature is, but often they are part-time legislatures. Our Oregon legislature is a part-time legislature. Often they have very much smaller legislative staff to cull through the language, to become experts on policy. They usually don't have the same kind of committee staff that will help provide them the relevant expertise, and they usually can't call as many expert witnesses and bring in a bunch of people who can help them take apart a bill and put it back together again. In Congress, it doesn't usually happen that the bill as handed in by an outside interest group is going to get through without major revision. The overall policy that gets that is encapsulated in that original bill the interest group writes is often really close to the overall policy that gets across the finish line, but the language has been changed and it's been altered an awful lot. But state legislatures will really, in thousands of cases, pass a bill that is either identical or substantially identical to, or substantially related to the original legislative language that was turned in. So that's one reason why bills could arrive like this. Now, I've said that a bill is policy in technical terms, right? And I'm going to put back over here the policy ideas. This is where bills are born, right? And this is kind of like, it's an amorphous thing. A policy idea will sometimes then go to one of these two places, and of course, a policy idea that a member of Congress goes to work on a bill, producing and then seeks co-sponsors. Who works on these? The people who work on turning a policy idea into a bill will be legislative staff. These are legal and policy experts. A lot of times it'll be a group of people that will include, among others, several lawyers and then policy experts who actually understand not just legislative language, which was what lawyers do, but who understand the workings of the policy institutions. They understand the workings of tax policy or of the relevant bureaucracies. Legislative staff who are experts will translate policy ideas into the legislative language. And from outside interest groups, they basically hire people who often have experience as members of Congress, as the legislative staff for members of Congress, and then they go get these more lucrative consulting jobs to basically do what they were doing for the public and for their specific member of Congress, to do it now for an outside interest group. And it's great training. If what you want to do is be a highly paid legislative consultant for an outside interest group who will be one of the team that puts together the policy in technical terms, the best place to get that experience is going to be in a legislative affairs team for a member of Congress, for a state legislature also, or for an executive branch, because the executive branch often does this as well. Outside interest groups, members of Congress, and executive officials are all going to produce finished bills that get sent right into Congress. Okay, and once they're here, they're going to undergo pretty significant revision. And what happens traditionally is that the bill then goes to the committee. Okay, it's assigned to a committee, and it's assigned to committee by either the Speaker of the House if it's in the House, or by the Majority Leader of the Senate if it's in the Senate. And there are certain guidelines to which committee or committees a particular bill has to go to, because the committees have jurisdiction, and you have to send the bill to a committee that has the relevant jurisdiction, though that can sometimes be up for interpretation, and also it is sometimes more than one committee has a particular policy has overlapping jurisdiction, so it has to go to multiple committees. What happens to the committee is that the bill is then essentially taken apart and reassembled. And the major inputs to the taking apart and reassembling is going to be experts and interested stakeholders, assisted by or facilitated by legislative staff. Now, every committee in Congress has the specific members of Congress who are on that committee. They have a legislative staff, and they're going to do some work on it. But every committee has its own specific legislative staff. And in fact, the majority party has its legislative staff, and the minority party has its legislative staff. And it used to be that only the majority party got to spend money to have a legislative staff to work on bills, but after some agitation, in the House of Representatives, the minority party actually now has A third of the budget for legislative staff goes to the minority party, and 2/3 of the budget for legislative staff goes to the majority party. The idea being that the majority party is going to have the strongest hand in reassembling this bill into something that can be, because what happens now is the bill goes for a yes or no vote, and this happens in the committee, and then it goes for a yes or no vote in the chamber as a whole. Between here and here, there is the possibility for amending that bill. Between the bill being introduced and assigned to committee and it being voted out of committee, it gets taken apart and reassembled, and amendments are added, and language is stripped out, and new language is added in. New policy ideas may be tacked on. Some of the policy ideas might be stripped out. In the traditional, normal electoral or legislative process, this is where most of the work goes on. In committee, among the members of that committee, who are assisted by experts who come and testify, and who sometimes come and testify and sometimes give written reports or other kinds of presentations, basically saying, here's what we know about this, right? So let's say that this is a bill that regulates the refining of petroleum to make sure that it's done in an environmentally safe and sustainable way, right? Basically, what's going to happen is the legislative staff is going to reach out to relevant industry experts to weigh in on the particular technical terms that are in this bill. Now, in a lot of cases, and for sure in a case like this, probably the outside interest group that produced the first bill in the first place is the Petroleum Association of America, or whatever other relevant industry group would want to have a hand in this. Or it could have come from an environmentalist group that wants to regulate the petroleum industry. The legislative staff is going to reach out to experts, often from the concerned parties, who are stakeholders, and then it's going to reach out to other stakeholders, like people who are going to be impacted by this. Sometimes these are executive branch officials who are going to be involved in the implementation of this bill. Sometimes it's going to be state officials if this is going to actually have regulation that's going to require cooperation with the state. There are potentially a lot of stakeholders. The legislative staff themselves they're the ones who essentially do the taking apart and do the analysis that brings in the experts, brings in the reports, brings in the stakeholders. The members of this committee, who are members of Congress, are not high-level experts in this area of policy. They do get to be pretty good rank amateurs in terms of policy making. Let's say that this is the Energy Committee. People who are on the Energy Committee for several different sessions will start to learn more and more and become pretty decent second-tier experts. But they're not really almost ever, unless there's unless they came to Congress with relevant industry experience that makes them an expert. They very rarely are actually subject matter experts. So we get subject matter experts both in the expert level coming in as well as the legislative staff doing it. The stakeholders are people who are not necessarily subject matter experts, but they represent the people who are impacted by this particular policy. All of these people come in either personally or through reports and provide information. And what happens here is that the taking apart and reassembled is both policy making and politics. Basically, the members of the committee, in the way the bill is reassembled, they are wanting to make it politically palatable, right? They're going to look at this and they're going to say, well, okay, there are things in here that I can't bring back to my people, or there are things in here that there are things that I want that aren't in here, and if I bring a bill back to my people for re-election or for my fundraisers or for my party leaders, it doesn't have this, then they're not going to be pleased, and they're either going to yank their support, or they're going to push the bill back to me if it's party leaders. So part of what is the stakeholders are contributing to the politics side of it. The experts and the legislative staff are contributing to the policy-making part of it. The legislative staff is also, I would say, contributing to the politics of it, because while they're not necessarily the political staff, of the member of Congress, there is always political considerations. They know that why would you go to work on 50 pages of legislative language on something that you know is going to be anathema to the Democrats on the committee, and they're never going to vote it out, and they're in the majority. You're not going to do that. You're not going to waste a bunch of time. There are an awful lot of pages and paragraphs that get crafted and worked on that ultimately get stripped out, or that ultimately get rewritten a ton. So legislative staff do have to repeat that work over and over again pretty frequently, but they don't want to, they're politically savvy enough, or they need to be politically savvy enough to not duplicate their effort all the time. The members of Congress on this committee, they not only have legislative staff who will sometimes help them craft a bill and who will advise them on this bill, but they also have political staff who will tell them, like, okay, that's it. This is a poison pill. We can't have this amendment. We can't have this feature. We have to strip out this user fee that is going to charge the refineries a fee that will pay for the compliance aspect of the executive branch's activities. That's never, they're never going to stand for this, and so let's get this out of here. So that's what political staff will kind of do. They'll look at the landscape of stakeholders and say, yeah, we can't really be behind this, even though it would help pay for it, and it's a good idea really to make the people who are actually having to do this compliance to actually contribute to the compliance costs, but it's never going to happen. So there's policy making and politics, and both of them are there, right? This is not just where a good piece of policy goes to die at the hands of politics. It's where a first draft of a piece of policy, which may or may not be good, right? Even if it comes from a member of Congress or of the executive branch instead of from an outside group, it might not be great policy. Just because it's produced by a public servant and not by an outside interest group doesn't mean that it actually is going to work to do the things it's supposed to do or solve all the problems it's attempting to address. So the policy making, the taking apart and reassembling is partly to make it politically palatable so that it can actually get through the whole process, but it's also to make it actually pretty good policy. And the reason why the bulk of this work is done at the committee level is that it's a lot of work, and it's grueling, and there's a lot of detail, and you don't want all of the chamber of Congress, either the House or the Senate, to have all of their members paying attention to and working on this particular very arduous but obviously also very important process. So the committee is central to the legislative process. Even if a bill comes, a 750-page bill or a 400-page bill that is, it's an Amazon link, and if you wanted to, you could just buy it. It's not going to just be passed on to the committee to vote on and then passed on to the chamber to vote on, because it's essentially it's a wish list, and it's a first draft of a policy. Even if the relevant writer of the technical language has worked on it for a really long time and would love it to be the final thing that's passed and has written it with every intention of it being capable of stepping through every phase without being altered one bit, that's not expected that that's what's going to happen. Now, as I said, in state legislatures, it actually is, and the reason why it's expected is because it happens so much, and it's because the expertise of the outside interest group overawes, and the resources actually overawes the expertise and the resources of a state legislative committee. And so this is one of the things that happens is that well-organized, well-funded, targeted interest groups do really well at getting their stuff through state legislatures, virtually unchanged. And that may or may not be good, right? I'm not going to get into an argument right now or an analysis of whether or not that's good. I think there are good parts of that, and there are, of course, obviously bad parts of that. Congress doesn't work that way. Now, what happens here is that essentially amendments at the chamber vote, right, after the committee votes it out and before the chamber votes yes or no on it, this is where non-committee members can have some input. And traditionally, amendments at this stage are only really offered in order to essentially secure the votes that are needed to get this bill a majority of votes in the full chamber. the committee might be, in the House of Representatives, it might be a committee of 35 people, and it gets voted out by a vote of 19 to 16. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be a majority of yeses at the chamber, because of the 400 other members of Congress who aren't on that committee. Some of them might want something taken out, something put in, or something altered in a slight way. Now, amendments offered in this way tend to not be very big or disruptive. I mean, they might be big in terms of okay, we want this to be $1 billion instead of $500 million, but they tend to not be many, many pages long, because if you're a member of Congress who wants to have a strong input into a particular kind of policy bills, then you're going to get yourself on that committee. And if you're not on the committee, chances are that you probably don't have a lot to offer. But the amendments here really are part of the ultimate sort of deal making that helps this bill get the votes that are needed. Because people who are not on the committee are still going to have to take home their yes or no vote to their re-election campaign. And they might be like, well, you know what, I know you guys worked for 10 months on this bill. You heard 1,000 hours of testimony and it's 800 pages and you did all this work, and I would love to vote yes on this, but there are a couple things here that I can't take home. So in order to get me to a yes, we have to add this amendment. Now, sometimes those amendments are offered aspirationally, with the hope that they'll be adopted so that that person's vote yes can be secured, but it often doesn't happen, and there's complicated deal making going on at this stage, and it may also be that let's say there's a strong majority in place that the yes votes already, the whip count tells us, let's say it's a Republican majority, a strong Republican majority of 245 Republicans, and you need 218 votes, so they can give up an awful lot of votes. They already have 220, 225 yeses without actually having to listen to anybody else, and so the amendments are really going to be offered just kind of almost in a political theater kind of way, because the whip count, which is the count of yes and no votes that the party leadership does before taking something to a chamber vote, tells them that they're fine, we're good, this is going to pass, and we don't need to wrangle or whip every single last vote that we could. So we don't really need to pay too much attention to these amendments. And one of the reasons why you do want to be on the committee for this is because chances are pretty good that a bill that's going to pass is going to have a favorable whip count once it gets out of committee anyway. And so if you really want to have a realistic chance of shaping that bill, you need to be on the inside, not on the outside. Now, this is the normal legislative process that occurs with regular kinds of policy-making bills. And you can see that it can be an arduous process, and also it is just because lots of work gets put into it doesn't guarantee any success. This is where, and this is you see this in the Schoolhouse Rock, bills go to die in committee, either because they can't be put together again in a way that gets a majority of yeses from the committee to report it back out to the whole chamber. It's a Humpty Dumpty thing. It gets taken apart, but it can't be put back together in any way that's going to get a majority of votes. Or powerful members of the committee, usually the chair, will find a way, if they don't like this policy overall, they'll find a way to basically kill this bill or tie it up, never let it even get to the point of having a vote. Committee chairs, and I'll talk about this in a subsequent lecture, they have a significant amount of input into this. Now, one of the other things that happens with bills is that they don't get written in this way. They are a policy idea that passes through a different stage, which is the stage of party leadership negotiation. And big bills, and especially quick, timely bills like the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill, tax cuts, the Obamacare repeal, things that make headlines, typically now go through this process. And essentially what party leadership does, and it doesn't even really need to be a set of policy ideas. They basically just like, okay, here's what we want to do. And we're going to negotiate. What they do is they negotiate the broad outlines of the policy. And they don't waste time cooking up legislative language, because usually it's a shorter time span. They want to get things done more quickly, and they aren't necessarily the relevant experts, and they don't want to use up legislative staff time to write hundreds of pages of legislative language for something that could change in 20 minutes when the negotiation goes in a different direction. And so what happens is party leadership, sometimes just the leadership of the majority party, if they don't need cooperation, or sometimes the leadership of the Republicans and Democrats get together, and the president or representatives of the president will also be part of this. That leadership input is necessary. This is what's happening right now in this very moment for the Biden administration's infrastructure and jobs plan, is that it is in this stage, right? There's a bunch of policy ideas that have been cooking for a long time and bandied about, and that come from all three of these sources, that once they actually hammer out the agreement, there will be legislative language that's actually kind of ready-made because groups have been working on legislative language, or there will just need to be new legislative language that is developed in that moment. What tends to happen is that when we get a negotiated bill that actually now is going to be acceptable to enough legislators to get it passed, because what they're looking for, they're looking ahead not to this, but they're looking ahead to this. And while there will be the same process, it'll go through the same steps and amendments will be offered here, this is where all of the real work goes on. And so I'll put a star here. And I will point out, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next lecture when we talk about party leadership, but point out that in the old days, and when I mean the old days, I mean like the mid-90s, prior to the mid-90s, this star here was the dominant form of labor that was done, and nearly every bill went through this process. It's become far more common since the mid-90s, and now pretty much for anything other than routine legislation, the overwhelming norm for this to be where most of the work is done. And then what happens is the bill is, instead of being taken apart and reassembled, it's just assembled, right? And so I'll put assembled in brackets there, because when this happens, basically what the party leaders are doing is they're saying to the committee, you guys have the expertise. You have the legislative staff that knows how to turn ideas in this policy realm into legislative language. We're going to give you this deal that we've made that may only occupy 10 pages of text, and you're going to turn it into 700 pages of legislative language. You're going to give us a bill that actually has legislative language. And so what does happen is that what normally goes into this and then results in a second step of taking apart and reassembling is all compressed into the committee assembling based on the blueprint that is given to them by the negotiated deal among the leadership. And the leadership either being bipartisan, from both parties, depending on if it needs bipartisan support, or usually, and again, now increasingly, among the leadership of the majority party that is going to basically go it alone. And any negotiating they do, like President Biden invites Republican senators to the White House, any negotiating they do is really going to be a marginal part of the process of figuring it out. The Democrats are going to mostly negotiate among themselves and a little bit with the Republicans. And then they'll say, here's the blueprint, turn it into legislative language, and then really what happens is it is then fast-tracked through to here. The committee is going to vote yes or no, but there's a foregone conclusion to this that the majority party is going to, all of the committee members in the majority party are going to vote yes, and it's going to get reported out relatively quickly, because when this is the process, speed is a requirement and a desire. Now, speed might still be months, right? Speed doesn't mean literally days. Sometimes it is, but even the fastest bills take a couple of weeks, and even bills that are fast-tracked through this avenue could take months. So, for example, the Biden administration's infrastructure and jobs plan is in this stage right now, and this stage could last for a decent amount of time. And of course, the members of the relevant committee are going to be important members of this negotiation. They're going to be called in by the leadership. They're going to be consulted because they know the policy in this area. Not to woo their yes votes, but to essentially have their input as people who have, you know, a level of policy expertise that the leadership doesn't necessarily have. And they bring with them, of course, the legislative staff that has the expertise. And these are the people who are going to turn this deal into a bill. They're going to be the ones who assemble it. Typically, what doesn't happen in this process is that experts and stakeholders are called in because that's time consuming, and really they're locked out more or less from this process. If they are consulted, they're consulted back here in the negotiating stage, but usually instead of being consulted, they're just considered. In other words, in the negotiating, the political considerations and political calculations that are happening here, right? They negotiate the outlines of policy. This is politics, pure and simple, right? What can we get? How much of our agenda, our legislative agenda, can we pack into this bill? And can we actually get it across the finish line? It's all about politics. And then the committee and its legislative staff is tasked with assembling the bill, right? And that, you know, even under the biggest bills that are 800, 900 to 1,000 pages, the legislative staff can do this pretty quickly. Like, they can turn a deal into a bill sometimes within a day or two. To me, it's astounding that they can do this. But in a way, it's because they already have ready-made language. They're not like writing a blank page, writing from a blank page. There's a lot of cutting and pasting that can go on because they've already been working with bills that have the relevant policy levers in place. But then, essentially, the bill gets, this is the faster track, and then it moves very quickly to here. And while, again, there are the opportunity for amendments, typically this is all political theater. Increasingly, this process is political theater. Increasingly, the arduous, long, expert-driven, sort of hidden sausage factory work of taking apart and reassembling a bill is being done less and less. This is becoming, I'm going to put 2 stars here, this is becoming the more normal track. Now, it's not necessarily worse because it's faster and because it bypasses the process of taking a bill that already has all of the relevant policy and technical terms, disassembling it, getting testimony from experts, getting input from stakeholders, having the legislative staff work on it. It doesn't mean it's worse. It is just that it's different. And it results in the same kind of thing. It results in 500 pages or 800 pages of policy turned into technical language. It's just that the negotiating is done by leadership, not by party members, right? And so one of the things about this too is that the reason why you can get to the chamber vote yes faster is because you pretty much have a whip count already back here, right? You know in this negotiation, and part of what leadership does, and leadership isn't just the Speaker of the House or the Majority Leader of the Senate, it is also the leaders of relevant caucus groups within that party's broader caucus. So when the Republicans had the majority and they were negotiating, they were often negotiating with the Freedom Caucus, which was the Tea Party group, which was about 40 to 45 members of the House. Between them and the Tuesday group, which was the sort of more wonkish, moderate policy group, as well as the party leadership, to be able to make sure that when they got here, they actually had enough Republican votes to pass it without needing Democratic support to pass it. And that was one of the driving forces behind all the negotiating that happens here, is we don't want to have to rely on Democratic votes to get a Republican bill passed. We would like some Democratic votes because it will show that Democrats like this as much as Republicans, but we don't want to have to rely on it for sure. So leadership calls in stakeholders, a lot of times the political stakeholders, in other words, other members of Congress, to do the work, to help hammer out the agreement. So the policy-making process that turns policy ideas into a final bill, right? And then the output here is an actual policy output. Of course, after the signature of the president or the veto and the veto override, the civics lesson part of that you can see perfectly well in the Schoolhouse Rock video. But the thing that comes out of it is a set of policy ideas that get negotiated for political reasons, assembled by experts in relatively rapid way, and then voted yes on here. Many bills don't ever get out of this place, right? We don't have an immigration reform bill because, not that members of Congress aren't writing ones, I mean, they exist here, and there's people who are, they're constantly being submitted, but if leadership is not even gonna, like, because how do you get from here to here? This is a leadership decision. Just because something is reported out of committee doesn't mean it's going to get a final floor vote. And this is where the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader exercise a tremendous amount of power. It was announced today, or I shouldn't say announced, a handful of Democratic members of the House of Representatives, and I think a couple of senators, have introduced a bill that will expand the Supreme Court to 13 justices. And so they have a whole bill, they've written it up, and they probably actually have the policy language worked out in technical terms. It's not that complicated, actually. That could be one of those that's only a couple dozen pages. But Speaker Pelosi pretty much quickly announced that it's not going to get a floor vote, right? Because it hasn't been worked through this process. So it's not going to happen that it even ever gets here. And it probably won't even get a yes or no vote in the committee. It might even get shuffled off to a subcommittee where it just kind of basically really languishes and dies. And that's what I think is almost certainly going to happen. For that bill or an idea like that to get back out here, it's going to require the support of the party leadership in both the Senate and the House, as well as President Biden, and he's already created this commission to study the thing, and so it's not going to be at least until that commission reports that, like, yes, the judiciary is broken, and here's the reason why we need to fix it in this particular way, before a bill like that even ever gets a chance to kind of get into the normal legislative process. It's political theater. There's so much of what goes on in Congress that's political theater. It's not all political theater, right? There's a lot of legitimate work that's going on. And while this stuff actually plays out now more and more in public, these leadership negotiations, and it is very theatrical, it's not political theater. This is the legislative process. This is now the beating heart of the legislative process. One of the reasons why Congress has such difficulty lately getting things done is these negotiations are very difficult. It's very difficult to craft a bill that is going to definitely get a yes vote in both chambers and signed by the president. Okay, that's the overview of the legislative process as it's focused on bills and how bills can look one way, or bills can come from one source or come from another source. The traditional normal process has bills produced this way. The more I would say the more dominant, the dominant process in contemporary politics comes through leadership negotiations. The committee is always the funnel, but committees do a different job. They either take apart and reassemble, or they assemble, depending on which source it's coming from. And I probably could have made that a little clearer here on this diagram, but there it is. Okay, that's the overview of the legislative process. Now the real question becomes, how do different players influence what goes on at the crucial stages in this process? What are the outside factors and what are the internal factors, structural factors about the setup of Congress and congressional elections and committee structure that impacts the final policy output? So this is how we get policy, but what are the factors that create the specific kind of policy we get? That will be the subject of the next few lectures.